Hey there, welcome back to Podcast and Amplify. I'm your host, Kristen, and I'm excited about this episode because I'm excited to share that Podcast and Amplify is moving in a different direction. So, I have enjoyed helping people launch their podcasts for the last couple of years, and it's been really fulfilling to help guide my clients from concept to the technical side of implementation, brainstorming episodes and topics, coaching them on visibility and using their voice, and helping them launch these amazing podcasts. And I've also been doing a lot more podcast audits. So, podcast audits are where I really do an assessment of my clients' existing podcasts. I help them see the gaps, I help them understand the opportunities, and I'll go more into what those audits look like. But I've really enjoyed them. I just really love helping my clients from that strategic level and helping them to optimize something that they've already created and they've already committed to. And so that's why I've decided to reboot my business and to really focus on providing podcast rebranding and relaunching strategy support. So if you are a podcaster who has a show, but maybe you're pivoting your business and you want your podcast to evolve with you and to speak to your new evolution in your business. If you have a podcast and you love it, nothing's really changed, but you know that it can be so much more. Maybe you started it yourself, you didn't quite know what you were doing, and now you're like, wow, this thing is really cool. I want to take it to the next level. Or maybe you had a podcast and you ghosted it because you didn't really feel super connected with it, or maybe it was too much for you to stay consistent with. There's a lot of reasons why we might ghost our podcasts. Maybe you're wanting to dust off that old podcast and bring it back to life again. Those are the three types of clients that I support on their podcasting journey. So if you see yourself in any one of those descriptions, this podcast episode today will be very helpful for you because I'm going to give you a couple of tips on how to get reconnected to your podcast again, some things to do that will help you to get really clear on where you want your podcast to go next, how you want to position it in this next phase of podcasting. There's no shame in pausing your podcast while you focus on other things or while things have changed and then coming back to it. You are in an excellent position. I just want to remind anyone listening feeling like, oh no, I'm like, oh, my podcast isn't performing as well as I thought it would, or I wanted it to, or I ghosted my podcast. You are actually in a great position because you've already launched a podcast. You are so much further than someone who hasn't launched a podcast and still wants to, but just hasn't done it. So you have all of this experience to draw from. And this next iteration, this next version of your podcast is going to be so much stronger because you went through all of the experience, did all that work. So I definitely want to take away any, I don't know, some negative feelings that sometimes come up when we have to, change something that's public facing and it might look like a mistake, but I feel like with podcasts, it's so flexible. And I think people like pivot all the time in business. And I think people refresh their podcasts all the time in business. So that's really fun. I think it's a good way to see this next step in your podcast when you're thinking about rebooting it or just pivoting and relaunching. And I really do think that your podcast deserves a second chance, right? Like we don't want to throw out all of this data we've collected, these experiences that we've had, and just scrap these podcasts. They can really have a second life. You've invested so much time and resources into the podcast. It's a really great asset to your business. You just might not have known how to make it work for your business. That's where I come in. I help you get that podcasting mojo back and really help you express your message so that people can see you as the thought leader that you are. You can start to see how having a podcast is a really great investment for your business. So let's talk about 2 ways that you can start working towards revamping or rebooting your podcast. So the first thing is knowing where you are in your business today. If you're making a change, being really clear on what that change is and how you want to show up. So I recommend downloading my Clarifying Your Podcast Vision workbook. If you've done it already, do it again because you need to reconnect with why you're doing it and you need that clarity around your new goals. So, number one, get very, very clear on how you want your podcast to represent you and your business today. I will link my Clarifying Your Podcast workbook in the show notes. That workbook is great when you're launching a podcast and also when you're relaunching a podcast. So you just want to make sure you have really specific goals and a very clear vision of how you want your podcast to work for you. Second, I would journal around what worked and what didn't in your podcast. It's really important to have lessons learned so that you know the things that worked for you and you want to bring forward with this new podcast, new version of your podcast. Documenting what didn't work is equally as important because you know that you can then leave those things behind. And sometimes the things that work are things that we're good at. They're related to our strengths. And sometimes the things that don't work are related to our weaknesses. Knowing our strengths and weaknesses and how they played out in our podcasting will be really helpful for you to understand what kind of support you need this time around. Maybe you're really great at creating content. Maybe you're really great at interviewing. Maybe you're great at editing. Or maybe you're not good at some of those things. And those things, scheduling, creating an editorial calendar, maybe those are the things that you need support with. So definitely do your own sort of audit of how you felt during the process, what parts stressed you out, what parts felt easy, what parts maybe felt confusing, and that'll help you understand what kind of support you need for your next phase of being a podcaster. I think it's so important to understand why things work and why they don't. And after you do those 2 things, I would encourage you to book a podcast clarifying strategy session with me. It's free, 30 minutes, and we can talk about the things that came up for you and see if you need that extra support from a podcast rebrand and relaunch strategist. Let me tell you a little bit about my new services. So just want to reiterate, I am stepping away from supporting my clients with podcast launches, and I'm focusing on supporting clients who already have podcasts to relaunch or rebrand their podcast. I love doing it. I've had some really fantastic experiences with my clients. And the way that I do this is through podcast audits. So podcast audits are great for people who are, like I mentioned earlier, pivoting in their business, merging their offers, reviving their dormant podcast, adding or removing a co-host, or if you really want to understand how to integrate your podcast into your content marketing strategy and your business growth strategy. So 2 ways to work with me. One is the revamp. And this is for those of you who really love your podcast as it is, but you feel like it's maybe plateaued in downloads. It's not really growing as you would like it to. And so inside the revamp, I focus on your podcast and I give you optimization strategies. I include a refreshed look. I refine your message and I help you with marketing strategy that will help to grow your audience. You get an optimization plan that covers these 5 areas. You do a little bit of pre-work. You'll get content upgrades. which includes your podcast description and your artwork. And then we get a 60 minutes to go over your plan. You get to ask me questions. You can get coached on anything that you need. And then you get 30 days of support via Messenger from me. And that 30 days is like gold. I've been working with my client and she has definitely been utilizing that as she's been implementing this plan. And it's just a great way to get that continued support. And I love doing it. So that's the revamp. The reboot is the other way that you can work with me through my audits. And the reboot is really for those of you who have really pivoted in your business. So you maybe were doing copywriting, but now you want to do more marketing strategy or something along those lines. Or maybe you want to simplify your offers and simplify your business, or you stop podcasting altogether and you want to bring it back. So the reboot is really like your second chance at getting this podcast right. And it's like podcast strategy meets business strategy. Whereas the revamp is more focused on your podcast and integrating that into your business. The reboot, we look at your podcast and your business, from your website to your offers to your sales funnel. It's a higher level of support. We go more in depth into your business. So you can learn more about the different ways to work with me, the different podcast audits, by going to podcastandamplify.com. And I'm just so excited to support you all in relaunching, rebooting your podcasts. It's so much fun. And I hope that you download the clarifying workbook to get that clarity on where you want your podcast to go next, what makes sense for where you're at in your business. I really hope you sit down and you get clear on what was working, what isn't working, what parts play to your strengths and what parts drained you, and really get that understanding of where you might need additional support. And then lastly, I'll say that when you relaunch or revamp your podcast, what's really important is having a clear marketing strategy, having a clear communication strategy. It's always okay to evolve and reboot things, but that's when it's the most important to communicate that to your audience so that you don't lose any trust, right? No one likes to feel like something's coming out of left field. So anytime you create a change, definitely make sure you have a plan for communicating that to them in multiple ways. And that's something that I can support you with. So if you want to learn more, head on over to podcastandamplify.com. If you want to chat with me about your podcast, definitely book your free clarity session, and I'd love to chat with you. That's all I have for this episode. As always, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Podcast and Amplify. If you love the show, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And the best way to support this show is by sharing, rating, and reviewing the podcast. For those of you who leave a review, you'll get the chance to win a 30-minute strategy session or a mini audit of your existing podcast. Thanks for listening, and remember, your voice and what you have to offer is needed in the world. Until next week, take care.